Our new story begins in some toilet. At first, the entourage seems not the most favorable, but suddenly we notice a guy who is strangled by someone else. He begs the man who is strangling him not to do it. But of course, he is not going to stop. Then he pushes the guy against the wall. At this point, the young man doesn't fully understand what's going on, but guessing what's going to happen next, turns around to look at the man. Suddenly, the man who attacked the young man starts to slowly pull down his clothes, thus showing his intentions. He also asks the young man to shut up and not to make too much noise. At this point, the protagonist does not fully understand how he could be in this position, but he still likes it too. Naturally, he still tries to resist and asks the gentleman who does it to stop. But his words do not change anything, and the man who captured the young man asks him not to worry, because he will definitely not die from it. The moment the protagonist looked into this man's eyes, he finally realized that the encounter he wanted to avoid by any means possible had happened in the worst possible way for him. Turns out it all started about 3 hours ago. Then the protagonist presents his boss some plan. He wonders the boss who is now having lunch. Will they really leave the black goat? A police chief who has absolutely no interest in solving this crime looks at the guy and asks what the big deal is. But then the protagonist, who is a bit furious, says that the gang is already in their neighborhood. According to him, in the neighborhood in the clinic is going on unknowingly. It turns out that this gang intends to get close to people in that very neighborhood, after which those people never return home, losing their lives in the process. According to the main character named Zhang Lijie, he has been receiving more and more complaints about the black goat lately. He thinks it's too suspicious, and thinks that there might be psychedelic substances involved. But the police chief asks the guy to stop. It turns out that the protagonist is just an ordinary patrolman, and therefore nobody is going to listen to him. The police chief, who wants to avoid too much hype, asks the protagonist if he really thinks that in their small town there may be some illegal substances. At the same time, in raised tones, the chief stated that their police station did not even have the investigative authority to design and carry out such an operation. The protagonist, who wants to get rid of crime in their town, tries to say something, but his boss rejects all arguments and says that if the guy is so bored, let him go and walk for an hour, while he asks that he just remember to come back. Upon hearing these words, the young man immediately ran away from his workplace, while the boss asked him not to walk alone. And seeing that the young man took his advice to go for a walk quite literally, he asked where he was going. But the young man could not be stopped and said that he was going on patrol, then walk around the city. The young policeman thinks that maybe his colleagues are too careless about the problem. He suddenly wonders why he alone cares about what is happening. After all, most often in his opinion, crime is committed. It is when you let your guard down. Suddenly he notices how near some building, a lot of men meet a man in a very expensive car. Looking at that car, the protagonist wondered what kind of freak had arrived in their town, because this car is clearly the highest class. Then after a short time, he immediately learns who this person is, because he himself gets out of his car. At this point, the protagonist realizes that he is seeing this man for the first time and assumes that he is not from around here. But he still cannot see his face because the man is too far away. At this moment, the protagonist is shocked by what he sees. It turns out that the servant of this gentleman hands him a bag. At first, the protagonist does not understand what it is, but after that man opened the bag that says Black Goat on it and started sniffing it out, the protagonist realized that this is a clue in the very case here are the traffics of all sorts of substances you're in town. Realizing what he has just seen, the protagonist sighs heavily and realizes that he cannot just pass by, having witnessed such a serious crime. That's why he decides that from now on he will not act as a police officer. After a short time, the protagonist was able to infiltrate the gang and pass into the building. He even put on his goggles for disguise and stole from the locker room for staff clothes. He managed to get inside without arousing suspicion, but if the officer who is his superior finds out about it, the usual apologies to the protagonist will not be able to get away. From around the corner, he watches 2 young girls enter some room. Then the protagonist adjusts his tie, and as an ordinary worker realizes that it is too late for him to retreat. He heads to the same room the girls went into, and after a couple steps starts banging on the door, supposedly bringing in an order. Having obtained permission to open the door, the young man does so, and apologizing, informing that he had brought the man's order. He was suddenly very much surprised at what he saw in that room. It turns out that the guy who is coming to this city is called Leech, the protagonist, who could not even imagine such a thing, naturally surprised. Immediately after, this action is carried back to the restroom where we started our story. There, he removes the glasses from his acquaintance and, holding them in his hand, tells the protagonist that it's been a long time since they've seen each other. And he notices that it's been about 10 years since they last saw each other, if not more. The protagonist is naturally dissatisfied with everything that is happening, and using his police training, clenches his hand into a fist and tries to hit the offender, but he easily dodges such a blow. At the same time, the man continues to taunt the protagonist and notes that the man has arranged a very hot greeting for him. After only a few moments, using the strength of just one hand, the man was able to hold both of the protagonist's hands. Naturally, the policeman at this point asked to be released, but the man, who did not even think of doing such a thing, gently whispered in the ear of the protagonist that he did not want to let that one go. After everything is over, the villain says that fate is a very strange thing. But the protagonist at first does not understand what he is talking about. Then the man emphasizes that he became a bandit for obvious reasons. But he does not understand why the guy became a policeman because he was an excellent student. He does not understand how the protagonist got the chance to become a waiter in this hole. The protagonist, who loves his job and realizes that he is not a waiter at all, but a policeman, immediately after a little thinking says that this is not the business of a bandit. For according to him, his own life shouldn't bother a man at all, and it shouldn't matter to him whether the protagonist is a waiter or a farmer. Then, after only a few moments, the protagonist starts looking for his ID card in his pocket, and then abruptly pulls it out and shows it to the bandit who did this to him. But the bandit looked as if he wasn't even surprised and was thinking about something. Holding his ID card in his hand, the protagonist says that while his former friend plays a bandit, he lives by the laws of this world. And even more so, the protagonist protects ordinary people. He says that the moment his former acquaintance and friend abruptly disappeared from his life, the protagonist was still able to endure. At the same time, he emphasizes that he has no idea what kind of black deeds his former friend is doing, but he asks him not to forget that if he catches his eye once again, he will go to jail the same day. Also, leaving the main character says that the man can stick the tips in his butthole because he doesn't need them. After these words, he slammed the door loudly and left. The bandit stayed in that room and even started laughing at the guy's behavior. He thinks that the guy is completely out of hand for that period of time while not seen. After some time, the action moves to the police station where the protagonist serves. There, his angry chief approaches the guy, and at this time, the protagonist cannot understand what is happening. But his boss immediately explains why he is so angry, calling the guy's very ugly words. It turns out that the boss is so angry because he does not understand how a policeman could take and enter private property without having a warrant or any other document in hand. At this point, the protagonist asks if his boss has already heard about it, but realizing that it is so, decides to reveal the truth. But the boss naturally was not even going to listen to the young guy and said that he had to provide him with an explanatory note by the end of today, and the boss threw on the table of his subordinate photos that were taken at the time of penetration of the main character in that building. Naturally, the guy had no choice but to apologize to his boss, but he still thought something was very strange, at which point his partner asked the guy what he was talking about. But then the protagonist noticed that he kept his mouth shut on purpose because he knew that he would get a kick out of the boss. So he becomes interesting how he still found out about his actions. At this point, the girl looked at the guy and emphasized that in her opinion, he is not repentant at all. Then the girl said that the supervisor could have recognized it. And for the CCTV cameras, she assumes that someone 100% reported to the police seeing a suspicious person. At this point, she even teases the guy because of his glasses. The protagonist realizes that Cha Jun-hyuk wouldn't make a fuss, but he still has a bad feeling about what's going on. After some time, it was already night outside, but the main character was still at his workplace at his computer. At that moment, he remembered how his former acquaintance had said he became a gangster for very clear reasons. It was as if the young man even saw the face of that very guy in front of him. These words made the policeman very angry, for he completely denied that these words were a cause for pride, while the bandit took it that way. It turns out that for these reasons, the guy did not want to cross paths with this man again. But since it has already happened, he decides to check if this man is in the police database. But after he started checking out the young man, the protagonist was very much surprised at what he was actually able to unearth. He didn't realize what it even was. It turns out that the surprise of the protagonist was caused by the fact that his acquaintance, and by the way, quite a well-known criminal, has no record of crimes that he has committed previously. At which point, the protagonist realizes that this guy may be too clean for it to be true. He also remembers well that when this guy committed some crime, he couldn't settle things amicably. And so the protagonist decides that he should be in the criminal database. The policeman even remembered the very moment of the crime, which he was personally present at that moment of martial arts. The bandit inflicted serious injuries that were fatal for the young guy. And then he did not regret anything at all. At this point, the protagonist began to elaborate on the incident as his phone suddenly rang, and it turned out to be his mother calling him. Realizing that he can't answer his mother, he immediately turns the phone face down because it's not time to go home yet. After some time, the protagonist already had some ideas about his old acquaintance. It turns out that he knew very little information, and he could not even know what he was doing. But he still managed to find out that this guy rented a house in the city and came to their small town from Seoul. He also noticed his noisy and ugly car, and also noticed that the bandit was stealing his money. It turned out that the policeman was able to get this information from the people who live in the town, after he wrote everything down. He thanked an old woman for her help, but still realized that even though he had already gone around the whole town, but did not get any special results. It turns out that the bandit came to the city about 2 weeks ago, and before that lived in Seoul. But the protagonist is most concerned not about this, but that perhaps his acquaintance is connected to the bandits who are in the criminal organization of Black Goats. These thoughts kept him on his toes, and so he tried to think of something to find a point of contact with the villain. But suddenly right in front of him appears the very car on which the villain moves around the city. The protagonist is once again worried about the taste of this guy, but that's not the main thing. The main factor is that he notices that there is no one nearby, so the police decides to examine the bandit's car in detail, which he successfully does not do. After the young man looked inside, but could not see anything, and for the tinting, he, for viewing the interior of the car, caught its owner, and at the moment when the protagonist was going to take advantage of the opportunity and quietly check the car, a bandit suddenly appeared. Being very frightened, the policeman immediately tried to use physical force to disarm the bandit, but he again failed, and the bandit, as well as last time, was able to easily dodge the punch. The bandit naturally starts to mock the guy and asks him how he can afford to throw fists. Even though who is in front of him, he immediately emphasizes that it was the same last time, and therefore he asks if the police are not exceeding their official authority in this way. Then the protagonist says that if you start considering what the bandit did to him last time, then his actions are the simplest and most permissible self-defense. But the bandit again began to mock the protagonist and said that since he wanted to wave, he could let in his other weapon, meaning the guy's baton. Realizing which baton we are talking about, the policeman immediately told the bandit to get lost and not to come near him again. But the bandit, who started to sarcasm again, tells the policeman that he can't do it, because the car they are near belongs to him. Then the bandit also asks if the policeman is really here to lock him up, at which point he continues to sneer. At this point, the protagonist was finally able to calm down. I realize that his old acquaintance has been keeping a low profile for the past couple of days, but he is also wondering how he can justify himself to the bandit for peeping into his car. At which point the man looks at the policeman in bewilderment. Suddenly he begins to admire himself and says that, could it be because of his bloody beauty? At which point the policeman tells the thug that he's crazy. He also says that he did not come to this place to meet him, so he immediately orders the bandit to give him the keys to the car, and he was at first perplexed. But the protagonist reached out his hand, immediately noticed that this car had been illegally modernized, and he even asked the bandit how much he had remodeled inside. At this point, realizing the disadvantage he is in, the bandit decides to give the keys to the policeman. But instead of getting the keys, the policeman received only a gentle touch from the bandit. Naturally, he immediately asked what he was doing, but the bandit only grinned in response. Then he said that it was too much. and again pressing the policeman against one of the cars that was nearby, immediately told him to forget about the car. He even asked if the policeman was truthful and interested in the car and not him, at which point the policeman thought a bit about his answer. Then he looked angrily at Cha Jun-hyuk and told him not to even think about doing something like that to him again. At the same time, the protagonist immediately informs that the bandit is now interfering with the performance of his duties as a police officer. Naturally, in this way, he tries to scare the bandit somehow. But then Cha Jun-hyuk again teases the guy that at any time he starts talking about his official duties. But he was still not going to lag behind the policeman and approached him with his head and said that there is one thing, but then, being as close to face as possible, the bandit said what the policeman would do if he started to interfere with the performance of his duties up to the young man's chest, and asked him if he could arrest him in such a case. But the protagonist naturally did not tolerate such an attitude in his direction again, and immediately took out the handcuffs. The bandit, who realized that the policeman without a warrant can do nothing, again began to mock him. And then the protagonist, using his handcuffs without unnecessary warnings and ceremonies, chained one of the bandit's hands to the mirror of his own car. Cha Jun-hyuk was very surprised by this turn of events, and immediately asked, "What the hell is doing, policeman?" But before he can even finish his thought, the policeman sharply pushes him on the hood of the car and says that since he doesn't listen when he is spoken to nicely, the policeman will behave more roughly with him now. After that, he immediately looked down at the bandit and asked him if he suddenly wanted to behave more obediently than he had before. But the bandit suddenly did not even resist, which surprised the protagonist. But then Cha Jun-hyuk immediately said that before he could not even assume, but now he knows exactly that it turns out he even likes this behavior with him. These words suddenly gave the protagonist goosebumps, and he immediately pushed his opponent and told him not to say such nonsense anymore. Naturally, the policeman tries to intimidate him somehow, but then he asks if the thug really doesn't realize what he's gotten himself into. At that moment, seeing from Cha Jun-hyuk's eyes that he really doesn't regret anything, the protagonist immediately asked for the car keys, but the bandit plays hard to get and asks the policeman if he remembers where he put them. Immediately afterward, licking his lips, Cha Jun-hyuk, looking straight into the policeman's eyes, said something should find the keys in his clothes by himself. But the protagonist was completely displeased with this behavior on the part of a common bandit. But at the same time, since he was a fan of such a pastime, immediately blushed, and at the same time said to the bandit to stop fooling around. He also asked, "Where are the keys?" But then the bandit, a little thinking, said that they are in his pants pocket. Immediately thereafter, he asked the bandit to stand still and also stop laughing. Naturally, the policeman was intent on getting the car keys. Then he immediately began to touch the pockets of the bandit. But when he did it from the wrong side, he immediately said that the keys are on the other side. But realizing that the bandit can deceive him, the policeman said that if he decided to make fun of him, he will quickly punish him. Suddenly, the policeman touched something, but immediately realized that it was obviously not the car keys. Because of this feeling, he immediately blushed a lot. But then the bandit said that it was not the car keys, and he had long since moved to the right. Then he emphasized that he wanted to live conservatively, but the policeman, who was incredibly surprised at what he had touched, immediately told the thug to shut up and not to say another word. Then Cha Jun-hyuk immediately turned to Jung Ije and asked him not to relax too much, and then the bandit sharply yanked the hand that was strapped to his car, leaving the policeman very impressed. It turns out that the bandit, without further ado, was able to rip the mirror from his car to free his hand, and he immediately asked the policeman how he could not have changed in such a long period of time. Immediately afterward, Cha Jun-hyuk asked the policeman if he remembered correctly that he wanted to open his car, but without even waiting for an answer, he grabbed the protagonist by the waist. After that, looking Jung Ije straight in the eyes, he asked him what he was willing to do for him if he opened the car. But without waiting for an answer, after some time, the bandit opened the car door by himself. After he did so, using his physical strength, Cha Jun-hyuk was able to easily throw into the car Jong Yiga, who was naturally unhappy about it, and did not expect it at all. Looking at the bandit, he immediately asked if he was crazy, but it was as if Cha Jun-hyuk was unstoppable, and he once again towered over the protagonist just as he had last time in the restroom. At this point, the policeman could do nothing, and wondered a little about when the bandit had such facial expressions. It would seem that he should have been thinking about something else. But suddenly, the bandit himself reminded him of it. Once again, using his physical strength, he grabbed the protagonist firmly by the face and began to rapidly approach him. At that moment, the policeman realized that he could not stand like a statue and had to say something to stop the bandit. But since he liked it all, he had no time to say anything. And then, after a couple of seconds, the bandit kissed his acquaintance. Of course, the policeman immediately asked what was going on, although you could see that he was very excited about this moment and blushed. But the bandit again attacked the policeman and once again kissed him. At this point, the main character's phone rang, and when he started to look at who it was calling him, the bandit even got a little angry, asking why he was going into his pocket. Seeing that the policeman went for the phone, Cha Jun-hyuk immediately snatched the phone out of his hands and thus once again made the policeman more angry, who immediately asked why he was touching other people's things. But the bandit once again laughed at him. He turned the phone so that the policeman could see it clearly and said that someone was calling the policeman's uncle, at which point Jong Ije snatched the phone out of his acquaintance's hands. But for the bandit, it was again only vivid proof that the policeman was still as soft as he had been in the days of their intercourse. Then he reminds the guy of what he used to say, that if he feels that he is unable to win a battle, he should not dispense with any means to overpower his opponent. Suddenly, the policeman remembered under what circumstances these words were said by the bandit. But the phone from his hands still did not give him peace of mind, and so, hitting the bandit's shoulder, he immediately told him to move over. Right after that, he got out of the bandit's car and looked in his direction and told him not to think he could get away with it. At this point, the thug still keeps laughing at his friend and said that if you listen to him, you can't even tell which one of them is the real bad guy. But the protagonist simply sends him away, while calling the bandit a pervert, at which point he walks away from where they were before. While the bandit was greatly enjoying it, after a while, the protagonist returned to the department, where he was already waiting for the boss, who immediately asked the guy what he was doing so important that he did not even answer his calls. At this moment, the guy was incredibly devastated. He didn't even answer his boss's question, because all this time he was drowning in his thoughts. Sometime later, when it was beginning to be evening outside, the main character was in his gym where he was practicing judo. The opponent suddenly grabbed him and made a beautiful throw. Then the protagonist, who naturally fell so quickly because it was the most unfocused, asked his opponent to get off him because he said he was very heavy. After only a moment, the main character immediately flipped over and was already on top. Then his friend asked him if he was offended because he loses to him all the time. But then Jung Ije was very surprised that his opponent still had the strength to joke and mock him. But then his friend immediately began to apologize. At this point, his friend reminds him that if a young man feels that he cannot win by any other means, he should use the most disgusting means, at which point he puts his friend's hand on his throat and says that if he did, he would pass out in 30 seconds. It turns out that this man is the same bandit. But the protagonist, who is a man of honor, immediately asks why he needs to defeat him by resorting to such disgusting ways. He immediately says that he just likes to spend time with his friend, while being on top of the protagonist blushes. Realizing that there was a special bond between them, the gangster, not yet a gangster, but just a friend of the policeman, immediately stood up and told his friend that he was embarrassed by such words. At this point, the friends embrace, and we can see what a strong bond they had before the bandit suddenly disappeared from town. At that moment, the protagonist realizes that he doesn't know with what intentions his friend said those words again, but at least something has become very clear to him. He realized that in order to confront his former friend, he must be willing to go to very desperate measures. At which point, the protagonist sends a request to the prosecutor's office of the Busan area. Already in the next scene, the protagonist, who is dressed in the clothes of an ordinary man, observes some place near which his former friend's car is again located. At this moment, the policeman realizes that this place is the same Cherry. At this moment, he suddenly takes his phone out of his pocket and sees some people talking to each other. And the topic of their conversation is snow in the package of vitamins sold in this very salon. It is obvious that the snow means some drugs. At this moment, the protagonist realizes that if this place is really connected with the Black Goat, then surely his former friend is inside this salon, which is indirectly confirmed by his car that is parked right at the entrance. A day ago, it turned out that the main character was very pissed off because his request for a warrant was denied by the prosecutor's office. He was very angry about it. But then, his still calm colleague asked what Young Ijai was expecting. Send me a request for a warrant, because the only evidence is his testimony. But since she thinks it was an unofficial investigation, it's unlikely to be accepted as evidence even if the case is publicized. At this point, the protagonist is very nervous and says that on his former friend, and in the present time a bandit, there must necessarily be at least something that confirmed that he is a bandit. At that moment, Guy's colleague asks him why he is so obsessed with this particular bandit. At first, the policeman doesn't understand what she is talking about, but Guy immediately says that he doesn't have the authority to investigate, but he is still snooping around by himself. She might assume that the guy is really a big shot, but she also thinks that in that case, it's pretty suspicious that a cop keeps running into him, and yet remains fine. She asks him what on earth a simple patrolman can do against a high-ranking gangster, at which point the hero realizes the truth. As he watches the salon, he thinks that he may be bringing the danger that his former friend radiates upon himself. But the words that Cha Jun-hyuk once said to him sounded in his mind again. He realizes that at any rate, his friend, who became a bandit, is definitely hiding something. And so the protagonist intends to find out what is really going on in their small town. Only a couple of moments later, the policeman was inside that very cabin, with a stun gun in his hand. He couldn't understand what was going on, because something confused him a lot. He realized that it was so quiet inside that it was even suspicious. As suddenly he saw a cold weapon swing from behind him. Naturally, due to his training, the young man was able to return. After only a couple of seconds, he uses a judo move he learned and throws his opponent to the floor, leaving him no chance to win. After that, he immediately put his stun gun to the bandit's head and asked him his name and the name of the gang. But the bandit, who was quite talkative, immediately asked him what he would get in return if he told him everything, smirking. Naturally, the protagonist is furious because of such behavior of bandits, and asks if the guy is really funny. As suddenly we can notice that behind him is another representative of the gang, who is holding a shovel and who is ready to hit the protagonist on the head. After receiving a rather severe and unexpected blow to the head, the protagonist remembered the words of his co-worker, that I asked him what a simple patrolman could even do against a bandit. Naturally, because of such a strong blow with a blunt object on the head, the protagonist lost his balance and fell to the floor, dropping the stun gun from his hand, at which time the bandits decided to take him hostage. At the moment when the criminals apprehend the guy, they are surprised to find out how idiots are in this world. After all, they somehow managed to come to the lair of bandits without a bulletproof vest. Suddenly, one of them notices the weapon with which the protagonist came, and realizes that it is a taser. At the same moment, he realizes that our protagonist is a policeman, and immediately asks him if he really thinks that he is in a movie, while insinuating that he could lose his life here. But the protagonist is not going to give up and says that if someone will die, it will be the bandits, and immediately asks them if they are sure that they can answer for their actions. But the thugs, and immediately grabbing the guy's head and asking him if he's really going to keep resisting, they continue to taunt him. After the rest of the bandits saw the face of the protagonist, one of them said that he had been wondering why this guy seemed so familiar to him, but suddenly the other realized that it was the same waiter their boss had chosen. At this point, they start making jokes about the policeman, saying that their boss's taste is for such handsome boys, at which point the protagonist gets even more pissed off and says that he would kill his former friend for such a thing. Right after that, one of the gangsters asks what orientation the guy is, but right after that, the other one says not to ask him about it, and only asks if he remembers what happened in the toilet. At this time, another gangster intervenes in their conversation and says that their boss had a lot of fun with this policeman. Hearing these words, the other says that if it is true, they should immediately undress this guy, and since they are a family in their gang, they should share. At this point, the protagonist is very scared. Being on an incredible adrenaline rush, the protagonist starts resisting the bandits and kicks them, asking them to let him go, while calling them perverts. At this point, one of the guards asks what's even wrong with this guy, but the protagonist calls them names and asks what they're even going to do to him. While the protagonist is fighting the other two thugs, their leader tells them to hold him properly. But the protagonist is not going to give up and asks if these guys really think he's a jerk. But since the numerical advantage was still on the side of the guards, they manage to calm down the protagonist, and with efforts, they keep him on the floor. Naturally, the protagonist is not happy about what is happening, and even very angry. But he is still not going to give up, at which point someone asks why it is so noisy. It turns out that Cha Jun-hyuk has come to this place and is not happy that it is so noisy because he just took a nap. Naturally, the guards are very surprised to see their boss here and immediately asked if he is awake. The boss is very much surprised by the picture he sees, and then one of the guards asks to look at the face of the protagonist and asks if he recognizes him. And they also say that if there are rumors that a cop got in here, their authority will be undermined, and so they suggest to get rid of the protagonist. And they also admit that their boss will want to deal with him personally, but the protagonist, noticing that the bandit is looking directly at him, asks his former friend to wait a bit, because according to him, first he will deal with these three crazy people, and then arrest them all together. After hearing these words, the bandit immediately leaves, thinking about something. But after a couple of seconds, he turns to his guards and tells them that they can do whatever they want with this policeman. The protagonist naturally could not expect that his former friend would act so meanly to him, and was very much surprised by it. Realizing that his life hangs in the balance, he began to resist again, which incredibly surprised the guards, who did not understand why he suddenly began to resist again. After that, he still managed to get out of the hands of the two guards, and also told the third to get behind him, at which point he asked him if the policeman really thought he could handle them so easily. Then, grabbing the protagonist by the head, he immediately slammed his head to the floor. He also said that if he twitches even once more, he will break his wrist very quickly. At this point, the protagonist realizes what a desperate situation he is in, and even surprised at his stupidity to try to find something on the Mafia boss. He even wondered what he could expect starting this investigation. Realizing that other than turning to his old friend, he has no options left to survive, he immediately says the name. He naturally realizes that the policeman is addressing him, and with a smile on his face asks what is going on again. Realizing that he cannot leave his former comrade in trouble, the boss attacks his subordinates and strikes one of them with a strong fist in the face. The protagonist watches in amazement, but the boss still can't stop and strikes a second blow to the very subordinate who has been holding the protagonist up until now. Young Ijai can't understand why the bandit is doing this. But even without an answer to his question, Cha Jun-hyuk leaves the policeman alone with his two guards. At least that's how it seemed to the protagonist. But it turned out that it wasn't like that at all, and the bandit continued to punish his guys for what they were about to do. At which point he turned to the policeman, and he asked him what he was doing and why he was doing it. But the bandit, who had already been seized by fury, was not interested in anything else, and he just noticed that the fly on the trouser of the protagonist was unzipped, realizing what could happen here. If he did not come, he was again seized by fury. He started kicking his subordinate's head until he bled to death. Seeing this bloody picture, the bandit suddenly began to have double vision and did not understand what was happening to him. He was able to tell his friend that now it's all going to end very badly for them, after which the Mafia boss faints and falls to the ground, while his friend tries to do everything to make him come to his senses. The action of the story moves to the hospital, where the unconscious bandit recalls his conversation with his grandmother, who tells him that his violent behavior and gambling addiction were passed on to him from his father. At that moment, the guy asks his grandmother why she talked about his father again. But then she said that the guy knows everything. She asked him to live like a normal person, reminding him that people do not change so easily. But then the guy did not say that he knows it, and that's why he tries his best. Right after that, he has another memory of talking to his friend, and Young Ijai tells him that the guy is trying hard to discipline himself, and that he sees that he's not as bad as he thinks he is. At that moment, because only his friend supported him, the bandit hugged him hard, so much so that the policeman told him that he couldn't even breathe anymore. It was after these memories that the bandit finally began to slowly open his eyes and regain consciousness. In his room was already Jong Yiga, who immediately asked his friend if he was awake. The policeman immediately began to tease his friend, and said that as usual he faints at the sight of blood, while the bandit slowly comes to his senses, and it turns out that he is not in the hospital, but at the main character's home. At this point, the policeman asks how only his friend managed to become a bandit with such water and hands him tea. At which point, the bandit looks at the mug of tea and smiles softly. After he drank tea, looking at his friend, he called him a beauty and said that he knows very well that the guy is a pacifist. Also, according to him, his friend knows very well that if possible, he tries to settle all problems peacefully. Naturally, the policeman laughs at the word that the bandit is a pacifist and says that in that case, according to him, when he grabbed his hair, it was only as a gesture of unity. But the bandit says that since the guy really remembered that incident, he did it because he was happy to see his old friend. But suddenly he changes the subject and asks to forget about it and asks the policeman if he's okay. Young EJ replies that of course he didn't have anything to do with it. It was his friend who hit his head on the marble floor. But suddenly the bandit grabbed the chair on which the guy was sitting and pulled him to himself and asked the policeman not to try to change the topic of conversation. At first, the policeman did not understand anything, but Cha Jun-hyuk immediately got up from his seat and looked at the guy carefully and said that he was bleeding when he found him. The bandit also asks if he needs to go to the hospital, but the policeman says that he is fine and nothing happened to him. Nothing special at this moment, feeling cared for, he even blushes a little bit. Hearing that everything is fine with his friend, the bandit says that in this case he has to leave. Of course, the protagonist immediately asked where he was going, but the bandit says that he needs to deal with what was done because now there are a lot of problems. Then the protagonist grabs his friend's hand and says he wants to talk to him about it, at which point the policeman realizes that it would be stupid to ask if he's okay, because the policeman started the whole thing, but he still has a lot to learn. But the bandit immediately says that it seems to him that his friend did not understand anything and grabbed the guy by the hand, said that this beauty will go with him, at which point the policeman even blushed a little. After a while, they arrived at an old abandoned warehouse, where it is obvious that there have been no people for a long time. The protagonist realizes that it all looks very strange. He said he didn't even know that there was such a place in their city, because he is a policeman and doesn't even know about it. He is very surprised that the bandit knows about this place. But then Cha Jun-hyuk said that it happens, of course. At this point, the policeman is scared and says that maybe for the bandit to deal with the situation and means that he will get rid of him quietly. But Cha Jun-hyuk says that this is certainly not the case. And then the policeman asks what they will do in that case. Suddenly, he heard the doors to the barn open, which frightened him very much, of course. But taking all his will in his fist, the policeman turned fearfully to see who had come in. Suddenly, he saw his immediate superior, the same captain who had been hindering him in the investigation of the case, enter the barns. At which point the captain was also very surprised to see his subordinate here. Pay attention to his calm friend. The protagonist is a little surprised, and immediately began to justify himself to the captain, saying that he will explain everything. Naturally, he believes that the captain caught him and his cooperation with the bandit. But then his friend grabs him by the shoulder and apologizes to the captain, saying that he was very late with the report because there were unforeseen circumstances. Of course, the protagonist is surprised to hear this, because he thought that his friend is a bandit. After a while, all three of them were already on the chairs. Then the protagonist, as if to arrange an interrogation to understand what is going on here, he asks the captain whether his friend is really an undercover detective from Seoul's investigative unit. He also asks his boss if he really knew about it and didn't even tell him. He's pretty pissed off about the whole situation, but the captain says that of course he was aware of it. He is also confused by the fact that his boss recently told him that there can be no drug dealers in this village, when suddenly his friend, who is an undercover cop, turns up. Then the captain says that it's because it's a very secret investigation, which he thinks is an excuse. But the protagonist immediately remembers the daily reprimand that he received from the boss, and of course very angry, and for all this situation says that the captain could at least hint him about it. But the captain, laughing, said that he decided that the guy should learn from his own mistakes. Naturally, the protagonist can't cool his ardor and thinks that it was all on purpose, as suddenly the captain stands up and says that he gets a call from the Inspector General. He also says that not answering the call quickly is almost like mutiny, so he immediately declines. As he leaves, he tells the guys to have a chat for a while, at which time the protagonist clutches his head and says that this could make him go crazy. He finally realizes why things were so strange. But he also thinks that even though this is an undercover investigation, he doesn't understand if his friend had to do this to him. He then put aside all his thoughts about the past and asked the alleged bandit if he was sure he would be able to cover up what had happened. Then his friend says that he thinks that everything will be fine because he plays the role of a big shot in the world. At this point, the protagonist realizes that he was in vain to get into this mess with the investigation. Right after that, Cha Jun-hyuk tells his friend that he is not happy that he found out the truth. But then Young Ije asks what he should be happy about. Of course, his friend says that he can be happy at least because he solved him, a member of the Black Goat Gang. And even without having the proper evidence, according to the guy, he has a better sense than most detectives. Young Ije says that it's because the main villain is acting suspiciously, but he's embarrassed because he's finally being praised, while the gangster looks at him and thinks he's cute. Then the protagonist immediately said that all this is really very strange, and he does not understand why the local gangsters took up such a dangerous business. Then his friend tried to answer him and asked if it is not obvious. Suddenly, the police captain enters the hangar again and says that those people want big money, which they are not able to earn in any other way. He also asks his subordinate if he understands where all the proceeds of the gang go. The protagonist, who does not understand it, immediately asks about it. But then his boss says that all the money goes to Huayan Chemical. The protagonist was very surprised and asked about that, or the largest organization is talking about. But then the captain said that it is the same corporation, and it turned out that they're all run everything some gangsters. And in order to curry favor with the very rich representatives of organized crime, the Black Goat rakes in the money and gives it all to them. At that moment, the bandit turns around and asks if it's even possible to say such things to an outsider who doesn't know all the details of the case. But then the captain clutches his head and says he wanted to talk about it. According to him, the inspector general, who had just called him, said that the protagonist was also joining their investigation because he had already found out everything. After some time, it turns out that after the bandit heard these words, he immediately left the anger with a disgruntled face. His friend caught up with him and said that it is not allowed to leave so easily. He emphasizes that he is well aware that his old acquaintances are very much because of the whole situation, because he was assigned a policeman who almost ruined the whole investigation. He says that he understands that this naturally annoys the policeman who is playing the bandit, but he also emphasizes that this is an order from the inspector general, so it would be better for the two of them to act together than to take the risk alone. At which point the protagonist blushes, feeling a little embarrassed as he looks at the bandit. Then grabbing Cha Jun-hyuk's hand, the protagonist emphasizes that the latter himself told him that he works better than most detectives, and therefore asks him to believe in him at least once. But the undercover cop is not so easily broken. Taking the cigarette out of his mouth, he turned to his friend, as is the bylaws, and asked the latter to end his entreaties there. Then grabbing the protagonist's hand, he said that he didn't see the need to involve him in this operation yet. At this point, they were very close to each other, which made the protagonist blush again. But at this point, the protagonist said that he forgot to do what he thinks is more important than all this. He immediately apologized to his friend. According to him, he is guilty of having so easily believed that his friend became a bandit, and even for a while considered him pathetic, while the latter, on the contrary, seeing him in a waiter's uniform, hesitated. Hearing these sensitive words from his friend, the bandit laughed hard, while the protagonist was in bewilderment at such a reaction to his sincere apology. But suddenly the bandit stopped laughing, and grabbing his friend by the throat, immediately began to kiss him, which naturally surprised him because he could not expect it. The guy tried again to pretend he didn't like it, and even grabbed the bandit's arm, but after a while he still turned even redder, and his tongue untied itself. Then, after the bandit stopped kissing his friend, he immediately asked him if he could go big with him in front of those bandits. But then the protagonist said that if it was for a cause, he might agree to something more serious. At this point, the bandit realizes that his friend is willing to do anything to be part of the operation, at which point he also takes the phone out of his friend's pocket. Dialing his number there, Cha Jun-hyuk says that his friend should come to him anytime, anywhere if he just calls him. After a short time, Young Ije was at home and remembered the first time he and his friend had gotten close, and it turned out to be at school, and the embarrassed protagonist asked if his friend was okay with it, implying that it was strange for two guys to do such a thing. He suddenly wondered if Cha Jun-hyuk was disgusted by it, but he just grabbed his hand and said that he doesn't understand it yet. So he says that he needs to check it out again. At this point, he is ready to kiss Young Ijai again. It turns out that the protagonist himself realizes that he was very inexperienced at that time and did it for the first time. But he thinks that if there was a name for their relationship at that time, they might have met under better circumstances now. Suddenly his phone rings, and it turns out that his friend is calling him, at which point the protagonist looked at the phone and thought about something. But right after he dared to answer the call, Cha Jun-hyuk immediately inquired about what the protagonist was doing and asked him to come out for the two of them to have a drink. In just a couple of dozen minutes, the protagonist was at his friend's house and told him that he had come, as suddenly all the guards immediately stood up and began to greet him, saying that they missed him, of course. The gang leader was watching all this, while the policeman was surprised not to understand what was going on. Cha Jun-hyuk immediately rasped about the reaction of the protagonist and asked him not to be frightened because he said his subordinates apologize like that. He also says that these people have been harassing the protagonist, but he's already punished them, and he also gives the protagonist a chance to punish them if he's still angry. At that moment, looking at the ragged bandits, the honest policeman realizes that he does not want to harm them anymore and says that he will probably refuse such a pleasant offer. Immediately afterward, the bandit requests that his friend come to him and drink with them all to strengthen the reconciliation. At first, the protagonist did not think long, but after a couple of tens of seconds, all the bandits were chugging and drinking in honor of the male friendship they had formed. Seeing the policeman drinking, all the bandits were quite surprised. But at the same time, they understood that this is what you should have expected from the guardian of law and order. But after the protagonist took the last sip and another glass of whiskey was poured for him, he suddenly began to wonder what he was doing here and wondered if this was really part of their plan too. Immediately afterward, suddenly Cha Jun-hyuk grabbed his friend's head, and after scrutinizing him and seeing his incomprehensible face, he stood closer to him. Naturally, the protagonist realized that all this is not just for nothing and immediately asked his friend if he was drunk. But then the bandit said that he was drunk before the arrival of his friend policeman. Then he begins to pretend to be a very drunk man, and laughing says that he is very drunk, so he wants to lean on the protagonist. Of course, the policeman realizes that this is just foolishness and immediately asks his friend to stop. But then the bandit said that recently the policeman even liked it when he molested drunk and even spread his legs. According to the bandit then, he only had to touch him a little in certain places. In his opinion, this is what is called perfect compatibility between people. At this point, the protagonist blushes at what he heard. He immediately tries to say that it was a different situation back then. But the thug only said that the guy then begged him to do it again. According to the bandit, the protagonist told him something, and then said that the police come to check every fourth Friday, and the rest of the bandits in the room heard about it. They were incredibly surprised by what they heard and asked if it was really like that. At this point, one of them guesses that the main character is their informant. They immediately begin to admire how their boss can negotiate, while the main character is just very angry. All because he realized that his friend and part-time mafia boss leaked the bandit part of the information that he possessed. The protagonist still cannot understand whether this is also part of the plan, or his friend simply led him around his finger. After that, the protagonist said that he would go to the bathroom for a while, but because too much time had passed, the mafia boss himself decided to visit the bathroom and check what the protagonist was doing there. Seeing that he looks very angry, the bandit approaches him and asks if the protagonist is feeling well, but then he turns around and sharply grabs his chest. Then he immediately starts yelling that if the bandit is drunk, he should still control his speech, asking if his friend is crazy because he supposedly accidentally told the bandit about the police raid schedule. But the bandit immediately begins to calm his friend and tells him to calm down, because according to his own words, they are not working now. But the protagonist still cannot understand why the bandit does all this, to which he heard a logical answer. It turns out all this was done to settle the recent incident and give the guy to earn points of trust in the faces of gangsters. At the same time, the bandit says that the guy himself could see everything at the moment when he whipped his subordinates for the attack on the policeman. In his opinion, it is very difficult to restore trust in this area if there is suspicion on his account, and therefore it is necessary to show them the benefit of the policeman. According to the bandit, to investigate with such input, data will be much easier, because to learn how the gangster lives, as well as to monitor the crime from the inside, is much easier. Naturally, the protagonist agrees with this opinion, but says that since it came to this, he becomes interesting in the role of the main antagonist, and at the same time his friend. He is confused by the fact that even the gangsters call him very familiarly, and then his friend asks him if he has never told him about it yet. Suddenly, he pulls a business card out of his pocket and says that he has his own particular means of interfering in other people's business and establishing his own order there, at which point he holds it out to the protagonist. After he took it in his hands, he is surprised that on that business card it says that his friend is an executive director in the same firm. He thinks that it is too high position for disguise. But then the guy says that the members of the Black Goat really had a lot of suspicions about him. But he still could not even assume that his friend policeman would want to interfere in this case while he is trying to take a confident position in the organization. And he says that although it has created certain difficulties for them, but everything is done for the best. He says that at least the policeman began to finally stick to him, which naturally very much frightened the protagonist, and he immediately asked when it was. But the bandit immediately said that this legend, and he is going to use it for the bandits. Immediately afterwards, he pushes his friend against the wall again and asks him if he can consider that they have everything worked out well. According to him, if Mr. Policeman will really like to play the role of a lover, the investigation will go much easier. At this point, the protagonist realizes where everything is going. But then, the thug emphasizes that for everyone else, the cop likes him so much that he even reveals police secrets to them. He says the Black Goat will 100% buy that kind of deception. But the policeman is not quite sure of the words of his old friend and asks whether the bandit really believes that this bullshit will really work and will help them investigate. But suddenly approaching the protagonist again, the bandit says that this is still a good motive to do anything stupid, and this motive he considers to be love, at which point the protagonist turns his head away. But the bandit naturally does not agree to this arrangement in this game, and immediately grabs the policeman by the face and asks him not to push him away anymore. According to him, in order for them to succeed, the policeman must really love him. Hearing those words, Jung Ije blushed really hard. Cha Jun-yuk noticed this, and immediately, without wasting a moment, began to kiss the neck of the protagonist. From that, he even shuddered a little because of the pleasure, but he still pretends he doesn't want this to happen, and supposedly tries to push his friend away. At which point we realize from the look on his face that he's enjoying it all very much. But he wonders why his friend is getting away with it so easily. But then, after the protagonist was finally able to relax a little and started to enjoy himself, said that it was not for him to judge this bandit. It turns out that all because he realizes that he himself is going to his friend, and therefore he is no better than him. At this point in the room enters one of the bandits who is very surprised at what he sees. He immediately slams the door behind him and quickly exits while apologizing and wishing the guys a good time. Both guys were very angry that the man went into the bathroom and interrupted their pleasure. Immediately afterward, the protagonist turns to his friend and asks if it was all planned. But then, wiping his mouth, his friend says that such a thing cannot be planned. But at the same time, he says that if the policeman is not going to continue this further, they should go back to the common table. And after a little thought, he agrees to it. At this time, he is also thinking about the fact that his bandit friend was right, and they are at work now, and so they need to be able to control their emotions. Right after the cop brings him in, his friend immediately asks him if he's ready to go, but the protagonist doesn't even shake his hand and just walks away, while the thug stares at his back and thinks about something. After they return from the restroom, the thugs are surprised to ask the cop when he met their leader. Then the protagonist, a little embarrassed, says that he first met his lover in this very place when he was pretending to be a waiter. The bandit naturally did not believe it at first and said that they are too close for such a thing, but the protagonist immediately asks if it is really that important. He says that the guys themselves knocked him on the head the first time they met, but then the bandit is even a little embarrassed and realizes that it's his own fault for getting caught up with the boss. Then the policeman says that anyway, their boss has told them the whole truth, and he is really crazy about him now. At which point the policeman looks at his friend and even turns a little red, thus confirming that he is telling the whole truth. Then the bandit immediately grabs his friend by the hand and asks him to get up, because according to him, he is already clearly drunk. But the policeman resists and asks why he throws him out, because only became fun. At that moment, the other gangsters intercede for the policeman and ask him to sit a little longer and not to leave. Because according to them, the policeman is not a girl, and they see no point in sending him home. But then Cha Jun-hyuk says that he will entertain his friend and tells him to leave. He also says that the policeman is now trying to get them to leave together. Then the protagonist says that it is not true, but his friend who is going to light a cigarette asks if it is true, and he immediately says that if he refuses, he will accept this refusal and sharply grabs the protagonist's hand. At this point, the policeman blushed very much, because he obviously did not feel very comfortable playing this circus for the amusement of the bandits. But he still stands up and tells his friend that he does not know neither shame nor conscience, at which point the bandit tells his friends that they will leave for a while. Realizing what's going to happen there, the guards say that their leader left their loners sad and even wish them luck. But right after they left the room, something very unusual happened. One of the guards suddenly pulled out his phone and dialed some unknown number. He immediately told the person he was talking to that their leader had left the room, and then told the guard to follow them. It's late at night, and the protagonist and his friend are walking down the street. It turns out that the policeman is very drunk, while the bandit holding him says that the guy needs to be in moderation. He even wonders how you can drink whatever you're served. But then the cop asks what the big deal is, and says that if his friend doesn't like it so much, he might as well protect him. Immediately afterwards, he asks the bandit if his friends believe their stories, when suddenly he starts to blush sharply. The bandit immediately says he thinks his buddies have fallen for it, and then emphasizes that he thinks they've had a drink together for the first time in their lives. He says they need to mark the occasion on the calendar. Suddenly, the policeman stops and turns to his friend, sharply at him, and tells him to shut up. Of course, the bandit does not understand anything and asks what the protagonist is doing. But then the guy points him out to some guy who's following them, which he points out to his bandit friend. Dear friends, and that's the end of our story for today. If anyone wants to see the continuation of this story, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Do not forget to put likes, and also click on the bell. And in order to come out the next part, you need to get 40,000 views or 5,000 likes under this video, and to make it happen as soon as possible. Discount this video to your friends who may also like it. Cha Jun-hyuk asked his friend not to worry about it, because according to him, the bandits are worried that they might do something weird on the road, but the protagonist naturally says that's what they're doing right now. He says it would be weird if people who were ready to do stuff right there just went home, and so he starts touching some of his friend's parts. But the thug immediately grabs the cop by the arm and asks him if he knows what he's talking about. At this point, the protagonist had already turned all red from his own actions and immediately asked, what was the problem? After all, he himself had told him to just love him. Jong-jae also says that as far back as he can remember, he confirmed that he was willing to do more for the sake of the case than he is now between them. And that's why he kisses his friend at that moment. Then the action is transferred to the main character's house, where they continue to spend their free time in an interesting way. After a couple of gentle touches, the bandit puts the protagonist on the bed and majestically looking at him asks, is the protagonist really ready to do this? By this time, they both understood how they will spend their time. Jong-jae, who wants it to happen himself, asks his friend, is it true that as soon as it came to this, all his friend's courage evaporated? He also emphasizes that the bandit will only benefit from all this anyway, while Cha Jun-hyuk is very surprised to hear such words from his friend, and says that no matter how bad a person he is, he wouldn't take advantage of the moment anyway. But the policeman is fed up with all this idle talk, because of which he turns his bandit friend upside down and lays him on the bed with a deft move that he learned in martial arts classes. Then the protagonist also states that he is willing to bet his friend that his 6 thugs are now sticking their ears to the door. He also says that he began to feel perfectly how some of his friend's muscles became hard. At this point, Chon Ije wondered how long his friend would still stall. But then the bandit had already gotten fired up and said that he really could do it gladly. At that moment, he started to take off his outer clothes and said that he started to behave too carefully. And at the same time, he said that since they had already started to have a great time, it was better to do it slowly. The next day, both heroes woke up in bed. It turns out that the policeman's sleep was interrupted because he heard some strange sounds. Naturally, he immediately noticed that his friend was making these noises and was sweating. so he decided to ask if he was okay. But suddenly the bandit cleverly turned the protagonist on the bed. Of course, the policeman did not understand what was happening and asked why his friend does so, because he just thought he had a nightmare, and asks, "Is it true that the bandit did not need to wake up?" But these words only amused Cha Jun-hyuk and said that he seems to be too deeply immersed in this dream. Of course, the protagonists did not understand what his friend is talking about and asked him to get down because he is very heavy. In return, he only turned over, and then the protagonist was on top, after which the bandit decided that his friend wanted to please him. Suddenly, after a couple of inappropriate words, the policeman hits his friend in the chest with his fist, from which he even began to feel very strong pain. Right after that, the protagonist got out of bed and said that his friend was unbearable. But he only stated that he told the complete truth and did not understand why the policeman started fighting with him. When he got dressed, he asked his friend if he wanted to stay in bed a little longer because he had to go to work. At this point, the bandit grabs his friend and asks, "Is it true that he is already leaving?" But then the protagonist a little shyly stated that it is indeed true. In order to stop him, the thug states that his friend only used him and immediately wants to dump him, and so with a smirk says that cops can't act so ungenerous. But the protagonist naturally does not give in to such entreaties and asks what his friend is talking about. He realizes that this is a simple ruse, but whatever it is, he should not give in and must go to work. At this point, the bandit wonders if they had fun yesterday, only because it's work. But when the protagonist said that this is indeed the case, he again smirking said that by all appearances, the protagonist very selflessly worked the night shift. He also states that he felt like he was trying harder than the main character, so hard that he almost even broke the bed. Naturally, these words made the main character start to feel self-conscious again. But Cha Jun-hyuk began to praise himself and said that for such diligence he was entitled to a bonus. At first, the protagonist did not understand what he was talking about, but then the bandit said that it was because of him he had worked all night last night, and therefore completely starving. After a while, both guys were already in the restaurant. The policeman was very much surprised that when the bandit told him that he was hungry, he meant food and not something else. Then saw the policeman's face when he said those words. The thug smiled a little and asked why he looked so sad about them going to the restaurant. He starts poking his friend again and asks if he is sad because he couldn't live up to his expectations. But then the cop says that he didn't expect anything, and so he asks his friend to stop talking nonsense and just eat his food. He also states that either way he wants his friend to know that he was only doing it because of work. These words made the bandit sigh a little. He suddenly began to bring up sensitive topics again and asked if his friend had not been seeing anyone for a while. Jung Jae thought about it for a while and even laughed. But in the end, he did not answer the question and only emphasized that Bandit himself understood what kind of family the policeman had grown up in. Turns out he feels really bad even if his family doesn't watch him, because when he does something like that, he feels like he's committed some kind of sin. According to the main character, all his past relationships ended rather quickly. But suddenly he became curious about what his old friend was doing and whether he had any relationships. He also became curious about how he lived all this time. The bandit, of course, says that nothing special happened in his life, but still tells that before the qualifying competitions, one idiot started to attack and he beat him up. Then he was suspended from classes and was not allowed to compete. According to him, it was because of this that something happened to his grandmother. But deciding not to reveal all his secrets, he just decided to change the subject and stated that it was a very long story. Right afterward, Cha Jun-hyuk said that despite all the hardships he went through, he was still able to grow up to be a normal person. But the protagonist? Such an answer naturally did not suit, and he thought about what is happening. It turns out he asked his friend how he lived before, because he really wants to know the long story about which the guy says. He realizes that the bandit understands perfectly well why he asked the question, but he suddenly feels as if he thinks he is not worthy of knowing the truth. At this point, the policeman asks how his friend could say that he took advantage of him and abandoned him, if it was quite the opposite. Naturally, the bandit is very surprised by these words, but the protagonist decided to tell him what he is talking about. It turns out the policeman is referring to the situation before he left the school. He says that his friend could at least talk to him. Hearing those words, Cha Jun-hyuk even thought about it a bit. In his opinion, everything is not as simple as it seems at first glance. And that's why he says that at that time there were a lot of different rumors around him. And that's why at that point in time, he thought that the best decision would be not to involve his most beloved person in this whole story. After this conversation, the protagonist decided to leave, but his friend asked him to be careful and to call him when he got to his job. Naturally, this surprised the protagonist and even made him wrinkle his face. He doesn't understand why he has to report to his bandit friend the fact that he got to work. But then he says that if the protagonist reports it to him, it will be very good. And if he does not report, it will be good too. At this moment, looking at the bandit, the protagonist realizes that this fool does not listen to him at all. A few moments later, the action moves to an office, where some girl is asking another young man if Cha Jun-hyuk is trustworthy on their part. Well then, the smoking young man said that he wasn't quite sure about that, and also said that what he was most interested in right now was that policeman who was always hanging around with the gangster. At this time, Jung Lee-jae finally gets to his place of work. There, his boss reminds the guy that he asked him to call him when their encounter with the bandit is over. It turns out the main character's boss didn't sleep all night waiting for the guy's call. But then he decided to apologize for his behavior and said that last night's drinking was normal. He also says that after that, he and his friend spent late hours together, but also emphasizes that the fact that he introduced him to the gangsters as a person who has connections with the police. After these words, the protagonist timidly informs that in order to make their relationship more believable, they said something very unusual, but then not at all surprised. Boss said that he had already heard that the guys said that they were dating. Of course, this could not help but surprise the protagonist. At this point, he is very surprised at what is happening, and even wonders if his boss is really not embarrassed by such a relationship. Then he states that he thought the bandits would not believe them so easily. And as it turned out, he was quite right. According to the protagonist, the bandits were following them at the moment when they went home, and so he suggested his friend to go to a motel, and there they tried together until morning. The boss says that this is already a problem. Naturally, the protagonist is surprised to hear his boss say this, because he just said that he is not concerned about this relationship. But then the boss said that he is talking about something else. He is not referring to Director Choi. Naturally, the main character immediately asks what is wrong with the director, but the boss only says that the girl behaves much more carefully than they expected earlier. It turns out that the girl is the director. The boss says that their undercover colleague has been working hard for their company for a very long time. Well, this woman still has some doubts. This fact naturally embarrasses him, and so he comes up with a plan. He immediately tells the protagonist that it's time to put on an even bigger show to win the trust of all the gangsters, and to close the issue for good. A short while later, the action moves to a beautiful restaurant where gangsters and the main characters and their boss are gathered. Of course, Jong-jae doesn't understand what's going on and thinks it's an evening of absurdity. Well then, his supervisor gets up from his seat and says that he was very concerned about why his patrolman doesn't show up almost at all at the station, but then says that he had no idea that it was because the patrolman was so close to such important people. At which point the director says that the supervisor is just flattering them. According to the girl, it is a real honor for them to meet the captain. At which point the protagonist thought that there seemed to be some good in public display. Since the head of the Black Goat Gang has personally shown up here to connect with the captain, it's obvious that their plan is working. At which point we learn how the preparations for this important mission were conducted. It turns out that the protagonist was very surprised that the cost of the whole operation was estimated by his friend at 300 million won. Well then, his friend calmed him down and said that it was just a show, in order to blow dust in the eyes and to show his favor. But the protagonist is still not as positive as everyone else. He wonders if it is really about real money, because according to him, if he gives it to the captain, then everything will be simply written off to the expenses for the investigation. At this point, his friend does not wonder why he is so concerned about it, and whether he is really sorry to part with such a sum. He is not interested in asking for 100 million to be sent to the patrolman. But then the protagonists say that this is stupidity, and such money is not for the patrolman. He is of course very interested in how the director reacted to this proposal, because the proposal to arrange a meeting with the captain is very unusual. Then his friend said that at first she was skeptical, but at the same time pleased. According to him, she said that we can have dinner together this weekend. The protagonist was a little surprised by this, but said that everything was going well. But then his friend states that now he is concerned with something else entirely, and suddenly asks if the patrolman had just gotten out of the shower. The protagonist says that it is naturally so, but still very much embarrassed. Then his friend said that the patrolman must have brushed his teeth. He wondered what flavor of toothpaste he has. The protagonist said that it is just minty, but does not understand what is the point of this question. And then his friend asks why he is so much worried because he just asked. Suddenly, Gangster asks his friend to swallow his saliva, which naturally surprises him very much and makes him blush once again. But suddenly, the bandit says to him that some of his muscles have become harder than usual. And hearing this, the protagonist blushed very much and embarrassed. He immediately threw away the phone. In his opinion, his friend Gangster is just crazy. Right after that, the action shifts back to a meeting between the police chief and the head of the Black Goat. Turns out at this meeting, the main character is feeling very embarrassed. He tells himself to pull himself together and decides that he'll just sit quietly and listen to the others socialize. But at this time, his bandit friend is playing with his legs under the table, which naturally made the protagonist surprised by unusual touches. After only 1 second, when the gangster's foot rose a little higher than usual, the protagonist tensed up a lot and jumped out of his seat, causing him to hit the table and consequently pouring the contents of the mugs directly onto the table. At this point, the director notices the strange behavior of the protagonist and asks if she understood correctly that his name is Jong Ije. According to her, it was with the help of the protagonist that he managed to establish a connection with the captain, for which she thanks the protagonist. But he responds with a bit of embarrassment, saying that he didn't really do anything for that. But the director suddenly wonders what caught the police officer and their executive director. Grows decided to go to such bad deeds for him. She argues that the protagonist is a civil servant who went on a crime for the sake of the lover. But suddenly she says that according to rumors that have reached her, and rumors that her CEO is very good in bed, she suddenly wonders if this is really the reason why they have become so close. At this point, the protagonist has a little trouble answering, but then his friend says that he also has a lot of great qualities. He states that he is very handsome, fun, and to top it all off, a good bed. The narcissistic bandit looks at the protagonist and asks how he can't fall in love with him, at which point Jong Ije is even more embarrassed than before and doesn't know what to say. Seeing that the patrolman didn't answer, the director said she was clear and only asked him if he really felt that way too. At this point, the protagonist says that he totally agrees and states that the bandit took care of him at times when he least expected it. According to him, this was the very reason why he began to have such strong feelings for his friend. Hearing those words, and the gangster himself blushed a little, and it was as if a spark flew between them again. After a short time, the director states that she feels a little oversung. She also says she had a great time today and asks the captain to meet again sometime, at which point the captain agrees and only states that he would be honored to meet again. He also says that it's late and it's time for them to leave, but suddenly the chief draws attention to the fact that the patrolman went to the toilet and does not return. At that moment, Gangster gets up from the table and says that he will look for his lover, arguing that he still needs to bring the car. The moment he comes out, the woman asks that Gangster not do anything unnecessary with her lover. But then the man says he can't promise anything. After Cha Jun-hyuk went outside, he saw the main character there talking on the phone and informing someone that he is now at work. It turns out at this time he is talking to his mom, who claims that the fact that a mother can't see her son on his birthday is completely abnormal. According to the woman, she is very upset because it seems to her as if she only reaches out to her son, but he only distances himself from her, because he never calls her first even if she asks for it. And she believes that you cannot just cut ties with your family and live as if you do not know them at all. At this point, the protagonist argues that everything happened because he was busy and had a lot of work to do. But suddenly his mother, who is fully aware of the situation between the protagonist and his father, asks him if he still hates his father. This question surprised the protagonist very much. But suddenly, at this moment when the protagonist is a little sad, Cha Jun-hyuk runs up to him and deftly turns the protagonist to himself, and then passionately begins to kiss him. Because of what was happening, the protagonist blushed and even his hands, but still some of the time did not try to put up any resistance. But as he suddenly realized what was happening, he hit his friend hard in the liver and asked him what he was doing, at which point the bandit said he thought he didn't want to talk on the phone so he decided to help him. And also, according to him, at the same time, he repaid the protagonist. Then nice words that he said during dinner. Of course, the protagonist immediately changed in the face and again embarrassed, but immediately said that they should forget about this situation and asked his friend not to pester him unnecessarily. According to him, there is no point in pretending to be in love when no one can see them. At this point, the bandit notices that the protagonist's face has regained the same expression. He says that before the patrolman went out to talk on the phone, he was in a good mood. Suddenly, he gets up from the ground and asks his friend how they will deal with this situation, according to the bandit. He would like to spend some more time with his friend, at which point he kisses the patrolman's hand and tells him that first he needs to take the director back, and therefore emphasizes that the protagonist will have to stay a little longer. He suddenly wondered if the patrolman would wait for him, but then he asked what his friend was talking about. At this point, still kissing the patrolman's hand, the bandit says that he looks cool today, and so he suddenly wonders if the patrolman is sorry to let him go home. He also emphasizes that if he can night provide high-class services, especially for the protagonist. When he heard these words, Jongjae laughed out loud and asked if Cha Jun-hyuk was ashamed of saying such words. But he suddenly touched the protagonist's face gently and asked if he was really feeling special feelings again. Right after that, the protagonist pushes his friend away and says that he is actually a horrible person. After a while, Cha Jun-hyuk sees the director off and apologizes for making the girl wait for him. But the director said that she had not waited for him very long, because talking to the police captain and time flew by very quickly. According to her, the bandit has a very good relationship with that policeman, and she even thought he really liked him. At which point the bandit laughed and said that was absolutely not the case. When they were on their way to the director's house, the bandit stated that he was working very hard. He said that even for the sake of promoting their business, he was spending time with that policeman. At this point, the director laughed and asked where to go in such a case, for according to her, he would have to do it for some time. Then the man said that if it was ordered often, he would carry it out. Suddenly, she touches his neck and says that thanks to her subordinate now, they do not have to think about the police. But for everything to continue the same, he will have to fully satisfy the patrolman they have developed a favorable relationship. But then the bandit asked if he should be rewarded for being such a good employee who follows all of his boss's orders. At this point, the principal, who naturally saw how hard her subordinate was working, declared that he would, of course, get his reward. She said they were going to negotiate a deal with China this weekend, and she would present the deal to him as a gift. The next morning, young Lee-jae texted his friend and told him that he had to go to his parents' house. After he read his friend's text message, he immediately turned off his phone and got ready to call the intercom. Naturally, he was answered very quickly and asked who was there. But then the protagonist told his mother that he had come home to see them. The woman was very happy to see her son on the doorstep of her own house, so she immediately ran out to hug him. She also said that they had not seen each other for a long time. When he started to examine the patrolman more closely, his mother said that he had lost weight and asked how he could work in the police force with such a body. According to her, the protagonist already had all his clothes hanging in sacks. But then the protagonist tried to refute her words and said that nothing had changed. Suddenly, he heard someone coughing on the second floor, and looking up, the protagonist saw his father there, who was looking down at the protagonist from a height. At this moment, Jong Yiga asked his father through gritted teeth how he was doing, but there was no response. Watching his father leave the second floor, his mother said that he is a real stubborn. She asks that their son does not pay attention because his father has always been sharp in words and actions. But it turns out that according to his mother this year, his father first began to ask if their son is not going to come to his birthday. Of course, the main character was a little surprised, and even at first did not believe the words of his mother. But suddenly he thought about something. Turns out he started to remember a moment when he was still in school. One day he and Cha Jun-hyuk were caught by one of their classmates kissing. Naturally, he was very surprised at what he saw, and only said that everyone already knew it was true. But the guys were in vain. He then began to mock them and told them to start dancing together. It was after this incident that the protagonist quarreled with his father. Then he cried before him on his knees. While his father asked the guy, is he really so anxious to embarrass his father? At that moment in time, the man was very shaking his fist and said that since his son had gone down the slope, let him drop out of school as well. It became obvious that before that he had hit the protagonist very hard. Looking at his battered face, we realized that he was worried that if he confessed everything, his family would turn on him. At this point, his father still blamed him for his addictions and was surprised by his son's infatuation. He thought it was disgusting. At that moment, because of his father's reaction to his lifestyle, the protagonist was confirmed in his worries. But he still continued to believe that everything was okay because he was not alone. After a while, all the family members gathered around the holiday table. The main character's mother immediately asked her family, "Is it really nice to gather all together at the holiday table?" Then the patrolman immediately stated that this is certainly true, and his brother supported this statement, unlike his sister, who said that their mother is too concerned about the guy. She does not understand what is so special about him, because he left home and made them all guilty of his deviation, and she still continues to call him and invite him to family parties. At this point, his brother also began to tease him and said that he is not capable of doing anything besides becoming a policeman. He suddenly wonders if his brother earns at least 2,000,000 a month. Their conversation is joined by his sister, who says that everyone around judges and prosecutors, and he is the only one who has not achieved anything. She even wondered if it is not bothering the guys. In their conversation, suddenly intervened the mother of the protagonist, who silenced everyone. It is completely incomprehensible to her how an older brother and sister can say such things to their younger brother. But at that moment, the protagonist himself interrupts this scandal and says that everything is all right because there is a certain amount of truth in the words of his family. Then he looked at his father and said that he was curious about something. Suddenly, he immediately asked sharply why the family had invited him to this event. At this point, his father only asked pour him some water. Feeling all the tension that hung in the air, the mother of the protagonist said that she was very absent-minded and almost forgot about the main thing. It turns out that she wanted to inform the protagonist that his sister is already choosing a place for the wedding ceremony and the wedding will be next spring. So she asks the protagonist not to plan anything for that time. But suddenly, the head of the family interferes in their conversation and declares that he can make any plans, because according to his own words, his youngest son has nothing to do at the event. The mother tried to somehow calm the father of the family, but he again said that when their son left home, he died for him. At this point, he even asks his wife if it is true that she is always protecting him, just because she gave birth to him. He believes that if the protagonist is not capable of being a worthy son, he should cut off all ties with his family, and asks that when he dies, the protagonist should not even dare to attend his funeral. According to him, this is the only duty of a son that young Ijai is able to fulfill. At this moment, he felt devastated. The protagonist clenched his hands into a fist and sharply asked why the whole family was ashamed of him. He suddenly wondered, did they really find the fact that he liked men so horrible that they were even willing to never talk to him again? You will not hear the answer. He abruptly stood up and behind the table, twisted his face, asked what the ideal son of this family should do. He states that perhaps he should sit and obediently nod at any of their statements. From these words, his father was taken aback and asked his son how dare anyone talk to him like that. But the protagonist, who was already on the verge, did not even think to stop. He realized that in order to become the perfect son, a man must go to university and get a job to brag about, obey people who do not care about his feelings. He says that if he cannot become the one that the family can be proud of, then let them continue to think that he is dead. At this point, his father became even more angry and, hitting the mug on the pillar, ordered his son to get out of his house now. The protagonist was naturally not going to stay in this place where no one loves and respects him except his mother, and so immediately got up, and at the festive table, the moment he was running away from his parents' house, he suddenly remembered his friend's message. So he decided to open his phone and finally answer him. The whole situation does not like the main character. He reads very funny the fact that now, after all that happened, he is obliged to seek support in his old friend. At this point, he began to cry loudly. At that time, the bandit was about to make the deal with China. He opened one of the cases and was surprised at how many illegal substances were in there. He realized that the people he was working for had finally lost their fear. Suddenly, one of his 6 thugs enters the room where he was, informing Cha Junhyuk that the buyers from China are already here. Hearing these words, the bandit was a little happy, and having corrected his tie, said that it was time for him to work a little. After a while, they were already on the street at the harbor. He asked the arriving people why they are suddenly backtracking, and also wonders if these people know who is behind them. Then he gets an affirmative answer. But that person also says that they trust Director Huang, but they still don't know the person they're talking to right now. The bandit asked Riley if it's that important, noting that they didn't come here for a date. He asks the customers to look not at him, but at the product they came for. Or he asks if the person really likes him more than the illegal substances he came for. Hearing these words, the second bandit from China even grinned a little and said that trust must be earned. At which point, Cha Junhyuk laughed at what was happening. He said it was very good, and asked if the man wanted to check the quality of the goods he was going to buy. Suddenly, Cha Junhyuk opens one of the bags that were in the case and begins to sniff it. Of course, the buyer was very surprised by this behavior and immediately asked the guy to stop. But then he grabbed the buyer by his clothes and said that if he did not trust the quality of their goods, he could make sure of it right now. And so he insistently let the buyer try the goods himself. At this time, the bandit gets a call from a patrolman, but he cannot answer because he is busy. At this time, the patrolman still frantically tries to call his friend, and after a while he manages to do it. Then he says that he just wanted to make everything okay, but it did not work out. Suddenly, his friend says to wait a little bit because he is coming to get him. At that moment, he remembers how they first met Cha Junhyuk. It turns out it happened right before the entrance to the judo hall. Then the bandit approached the protagonist and asked why he did not go in. Even the unexpected appearance of the bandit frightened the guy at that time, but he realized that he was safe. After all, this guy is from his class. He also knew his name, which naturally surprised the bandit a little. But then, Cha Junhyuk said that he also knows the protagonist and is aware that he is the same guy from the first desk. Of course, the protagonist was surprised at such scant information about himself, and even surprised that this young man could not even remember his name. Cha Junhyuk asked the protagonist if he wanted to do judo, and then he heard a negative answer. But he was very surprised and said that judo is a very fun activity, and so the protagonist can join them. At this point, the protagonist only reflected on the fact that he had previously thought that this guy looked tough. But looking at his face now, he realizes that this is not the case at all. It turns out the bandit then offered the protagonist to teach him some techniques, thus facilitating his training in the judo hall. At this point, the protagonist got very excited and realized that when this guy talks about what he really likes, he becomes like a kid who got what he wanted. Dear friends, and if you want to see the next part of this manga, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and do not forget to click on the bell to not miss new videos. And of course, we will definitely do for you the next part when this video will collect 40,000 views or 5,000 likes.